It's on. Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull go head-to-head in a leadership ballot later tonight.
The Prime Ministership of this country is not a prize or a plaything to be demanded. It should be something which is earned.
The challenger makes his pitch to lead the Liberal Party and Australia.
We have to make a change for our country's sake, for the government's sake, for the party's sake.
Good evening, Ian Henderson with ABC News. Tony Abbott's job is on the line tonight. Unhappiness has been growing within Liberal ranks for weeks, and today Malcolm Turnbull said it was time Mr Abbott was removed as Prime Minister. We're crossing now to our political editor Chris Uhlmann in Canberra.
Good evening. For the sixth time in 5 years, a sitting Prime Minister is facing a party room revolt. Shortly after question time, the Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull told Tony Abbott he was resigning from Cabinet and calling for a leadership spill. The Deputy Leader, Julie Bishop, has also told the Prime Minister he's lost the support of the party room. There will be an extraordinary party room meeting and a ballot for the leadership and deputy leadership tonight. Malcolm Turnbull says he's offering leadership that's not reduced to slogans. Tony Abbott has urged his party not to change leaders, saying the Prime Minister's job is not a prize to be demanded, but is the gift of the Australian people. Our coverage begins with this report by James Glenday.
On a relatively slow spring afternoon, Malcolm Turnbull delivered a bombshell 8 months in the making.
A little while ago, I met with the Prime Minister and advised him that I would be challenging him for the leadership of the Liberal Party.
In a 6-minute statement, he outlined his reasons.
The Prime Minister has not been capable of providing the economic leadership our nation needs.
Declared he'd offer his party and the nation a different style of leadership.
There must be an end to policy on the run and captain's calls.
And promised to be a much better salesman than the current PM.
We need advocacy, not slogans. We need to respect the intelligence of the Australian people.
He quit as Communications Minister just after question time. The influential Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, is in his corner. She told the Prime Minister earlier in the day.
Go those Sharkies.
The ABC understands Scott Morrison, one of the government's brightest stars, isn't fighting the leadership push. Whatever happens, many MPs expect him to replace Joe Hockey as Treasurer.
I'm not going to play Canberra games.
This morning, Tony Abbott was downright dismissive of leadership talk.
The media particularly like to play the Canberra game.
But discontent has been building for months. The epicentre appears to be the AFL states like Victoria and South Australia, where many MPs fear electoral oblivion.
One thing that is clear about our current situation is the trajectory. We have lost 30 news polls in a row. It is clear that the people have made up their mind about Mr Abbott's leadership.
John Howard's Chief of Staff and former Assistant Treasurer Arthur Sinodinos was one of the first to publicly declare he's in the Turnbull camp.
It's been in some ways a difficult decision, I think, for him to make, to challenge.
But the Prime Minister has a well-deserved reputation as a fighter and support on parts of the backbench.
The Prime Ministership of this country is not a prize or a plaything to be demanded.
A ballot for the leadership and deputy positions will be held this evening. The Prime Minister says he expects to win and is demanding the destabilisation stop.
I firmly believe that our party is better than this, that our government is better than this, and by God, that our country is so much better than this.
Parliament's corridors are quiet for now as the candidates do the numbers, but earlier this afternoon the chaotic scenes here were reminiscent of the dying days of Julia Gillard's government. If Malcolm Turnbull wins tonight's leadership spill, he'll become the 4th Australian Prime Minister in a little over 2 years and 2 months. James Glenday, ABC News, Canberra.
I'm joined now by the Government Whip, Andrew Nikolic. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris.
2 challenges in the space of a year. Why should Tony Abbott stay as Prime Minister?
Well, Chris, if you could see my computer and phone at the moment, you'll see they've gone into meltdown.
The message we're getting is that the Prime Ministership is a gift to the people. It's not a plaything for politics, and clearly this type of political culture was explicitly repudiated by the people at the 2013 election. We've got a lot to celebrate as a government, and what the people are telling me in the aftermath of this decision is we should be better than this.
But you can't even convince your own cabinet of that. What chance have you got of convincing the Australian people?
Well, I think Tony Abbott and his executive leadership team have got a lot to celebrate, a lot of achievements that we've had in the last 2 years.
And why isn't the cabinet celebrating?
Well, what people are telling us is that they do not want to revisit the sort of dysfunction and bad political culture that they repudiated under the Labor Party.
You have dysfunction, you have a bad political culture. That's just a fact.
Well, what I think we need to do is to not treat the Prime Ministership as a political plaything. The many hundreds of people that are communicating with me and my other colleagues this evening are saying exactly the same thing. 300,000 jobs produced by this government. In my home state of Tasmania, instead of an 8 in front of the unemployment rate, there's now a 6. We are making progress in so many areas. The last thing we need is to repeat the dysfunction of the Labor Party, and I think Tony Abbott will get strong support in the party room.
And again, I ask, why do so many members of your party room and so many members of your cabinet, including the deputy leader of your party, not believe what you've just said?
Well, Chris, it's enormously unhelpful, and the person I feel for the most is Andrew Hastie, who's less than a week away. He's all in Canning. He's a young man with an incredible history who is all in, and here we are a week before, you know, the most important event of his life, the by-election in Canning, and we're doing this. It is extraordinary, and I feel for him at this time.
Imagine the Prime Minister does win this ballot, but doesn't win it by very much. How does he continue as a legitimate figure in public life, really, by being twice challenged by his party within the space of a year?
Well, what we need to do is rebuild unity of purpose, because you know, the people out there know, without unity of purpose you can't achieve a lot. This sort of dysfunction was repudiated by the people under the Labor Party. I'm staggered we're repeating it again. The many hundreds of people contacting me feel the same way. I know the Prime Minister will have strong support.
Andrew Nikolic, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, this is not Malcolm Turnbull's first tilt at the Liberal leadership. He successfully challenged Brendan Nelson in 2008 before being toppled himself by Tony Abbott, and by just one vote. Political correspondent Greg Jennett takes a look at the man who would be Prime Minister.
Always highly visible.
It's a lot faster and it's a lot cheaper.
And a constant communicator. Malcolm Turnbull enjoys greater recognition than most who've served a decade in Parliament.
I'm flat out with my current job. Yeah, okay. You're the best man for it. Oh, you're very kind.
That's because formal politics was just the end point of a life in the public eye. Born in 1954, he was mostly raised by his father, went through Sydney Grammar School, Sydney Uni, won a Rhodes Scholarship and quickly shone in the law. By the late 1980s, business called as a merchant banker. Fortunes were made, including shrewd investments in the emerging internet industry. But it was as leader of the Republic movement that political skills were honed and horns locked with a friend and adversary.
What makes our constitution work?
We're stuck with the British monarchy forever, is that right?
Malcolm Turnbull arrived in Canberra in the class of 2004.
I am proud and honoured to address this House today as the member for Wentworth.
Within a term, he was made a parliamentary secretary and then Environment Minister till the fall of the Howard government. In opposition, he held the Treasury portfolio, sitting uncomfortably beneath leader Brendan Nelson until a spill.
I do not come to the position of leader of the Liberal Party from a lifetime of privilege.
He said his sights on bringing down a first-term Prime Minister, but with too much haste.
They have no choice but to resign.
Relying on a leaking public servant named Godwin Gretsch. But Kevin Rudd turned out to be the least of Mr Turnbull's worries.
Party room on emissions trading.
His party shut down his leadership over climate change by just one vote in 2010.
Well, I'm all done.
There was a reawakening and a frontbench comeback with a mission to reinvent the national broadband network.
What we are going to do is get this job done.
As Minister, he was remade and gave his word he'd be a team player for Tony Abbott.
Tony has had utter loyalty and consistency from his front bench.
Until he would no longer. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Canberra.
ABC reporter Ben Worsley joins us now from Malcolm Turnbull's electorate of Wentworth in Sydney. Ben, what have you been hearing?
Well, Chris, among the voters that we've spoken to here in Bondi Junction, there is overwhelming support for Malcolm Turnbull's move against Tony Abbott, but in many ways that is entirely unsurprising. Malcolm Turnbull won 63% of the primary vote here in the last federal election. Wentworth is Australia's smallest federal electorate, its most densely populated and its most affluent. Turnbull's been the sitting member here since 2004, and from the voters we've spoken to, it's his progressive brand of Liberal Party politics that they seem to like. They cite his stance on gay marriage, his stance on climate change as things they particularly admire, things that most starkly differentiate him from Tony Abbott.
I don't have a problem with Tony, but I think the public probably would support Malcolm Turnbull more.
Suddenly he must have realised that for the good of the party, he has to now challenge and see what happens.
Do you think it would be for the good of the party in terms of the next election?
Yes.
Thumbs up?
Oh yeah, totally.
Why is that?
I think he's more intelligent, I think he's more sympathetic, I think he has better Australian values. I think he's a really good Member of Parliament, and I don't vote Liberal.
Now, when Malcolm Turnbull won pre-selection here in 2004, it was after a coup against the sitting Liberal member in Peter King. There are obvious parallels with how he's trying to wrest the Prime Ministership from Tony Abbott. Very few people here, though, seem to mind.
Thank you, Ben. Catherine Stolarchuk joins us now from Manly and Tony Abbott's electorate of Warringah. And Catherine, you've been canvassing voters there. What are they saying?
Well, Chris, Tony Abbott has held this seat here for more than a decade, first winning it in 1994. In 2013, he won the electorate with 65% of the two-party preferred vote. So he has always been very popular here, but lately his popularity does seem to be on the wane. We spoke to a number of people this afternoon, and most of them, I have to say, seemed pretty happy about the fact that Tony Abbott might not be Prime Minister for too much longer. Let's take a listen.
I think it's a very difficult job that he's got. Everyone seems to have knives out everywhere. I think Turnbull should just sit back and do the job that he's been allocated.
I would prefer Malcolm Turnbull.
Have you ever supported Tony Abbott? Has your opinion have been changed? Or?
No, my opinion's never changed, and I don't support him.
I'm sorry to hear it, only because with Abbott in charge of the Liberal Party, the next election would have gone to Bill Shorten. I think Turnbull will be a far more formidable opponent.
So a range of opinions there on the job that Tony Abbott has been doing as Prime Minister. Now, when Tony Abbott came into office in 2013, he came in a hero, having effectively cut down 2 Labor Prime Ministers. The speed with which his Prime Ministership was hit by not 1 but 2 spills has surprised both his supporters and his detractors, who had thought that the disease of changing leaders was just for Labor. Julie Doyle takes this look at Tony Abbott's Prime Ministership.
Again, the government of Australia has changed.
High office came after almost 20 years in Parliament.
I declare that Australia is under new management and that Australia is once more open for business.
Business was done. Boats stopped, taxes were scrapped. Australia's 28th Prime Minister moved the seat of government to East Arnhem Land for almost a week. And moved often around the globe meeting world leaders. He cut trade deals with 3 of them and hosted 20 at home in an unprecedented week of power.
Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
But doing business in Canberra grew ever tougher, with a slowing economy, a hostile Senate and an unpopular budget. Courage never seemed lacking.
I'm going to shirt front Mr Putin.
But judgment was often called into question on loyalty to staff and on captain's picks. By late 2014, he was publicly apologising, reshuffling his ministry and launching barnacle-clearing backdowns. But the new year brought disaster. Prince Philip's knighthood and the coalition's wipeout in Queensland amplified those nagging questions about judgment. And in February, backbench discontent with Tony Abbott's performance came to a head. in the form of a leadership spill motion. Tony Abbott survived his near-death experience.
I've listened, I've learned.
But tension within Cabinet derailed the agenda. Along the way, Tony Abbott lost a captain's pick, but the resignation didn't satisfy critics, who argued Tony Abbott was too slow to act.
The problem is not any particular individual.
And the Cabinet leaks kept coming. The Prime Minister read his colleagues the Riot Act, but there was another embarrassing disclosure.
What I'm not going to do is accept lectures on cabinet solidarity from a leader of the opposition who backstabbed 2 Prime Ministers.
But keeping his cabinet on side proved to be the Prime Minister's biggest challenge. Julie Doyle, ABC News, Canberra.
The leadership turmoil comes just 5 days before the Canning by-election in Western Australia. Today's poll in the Fairfax newspapers foreshadowed a 10% swing against the government in what's long been a safe seat for the Liberal Party. Our reporter Emily Peace joins us now from Kelmscott and Canning. And Emily, this is bound to have an effect on Saturday's by-election.
That's right, Chris. Inevitably it will have an impact on the by-election. The Prime Minister's leadership has shaped this campaign from the outset for both sides. The Liberal Party has sought to orient its campaign around candidate Andrew Hastie, emphasising his personal qualities, his military background, and really focusing on local issues like jobs and infrastructure. And whenever the conversations turn to Canberra, Andrew Hastie's been very keen to bring it back to Canning voters. Now, the Labor Party's been keen to emphasise national issues from the start, and they've sought to frame this by-election as a poll on Tony Abbott's leadership and the government's performance overall. So it's fair to say this leadership spill will have a dramatic impact on the campaign's tenor and direction in its final days.
And is there any indication that a change of leader would change the voters' minds?
Well, the indications that we've had to date, all the polls have suggested there will be a swing against the government, and the perception is that that's largely due to Tony Abbott's leadership, or at least that's what political analysts have said. And as I've mentioned, both the major political parties have shaped their campaigns around that issue. The question now, though, is what the outcome of the leadership spill will be and whether that would indeed change voters' minds. Some political analysts say that any indication of disunity would be a negative for the Liberal Party. Others say that switching to Malcolm Turnbull could help the party on Saturday.
Emily Peace, thanks for that. And Treasurer Joe Hockey addressed the media a short time ago. He's standing by his leader and urging the Liberal Party to do the same.
We cannot, we must not become a carbon copy of the Labor Party. We cannot and we must not make the same mistakes that were made in the Rudd and Gillard years. The Australian people deserve better. We must put the national interest ahead of any self-interest. The Prime Minister has my absolute loyalty, as I have his.
Well, the ABC's election analyst Anthony Green is with us now. And Anthony, there's a lot to ponder here. What's the possibility that a change in leader could trigger an early election?
Well, that's possible, but I think seriously the government, if there's a change of leader, the government would have to actually try and look like it's governing for a period. There's a view that Julia Gillard went to the polls too quickly after she became Prime Minister, so they wouldn't want to repeat that mistake. If the government under Malcolm Turnbull wants to create a new agenda, which is the thing he's been talking about, it's going to take time to convince the electorate of that. You can't just change leader and run off to the polls, so you'd imagine it doesn't mean an early election.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull's long been a popular leader in opinion polls. Will that convert into electoral success?
Well, that's the question. He's been very popular amongst Labor voters, but how many of them are going to change and vote the Liberal Party? He's not liked by parts of the Liberal Party, parts of the right of the Liberal Party. That may cause disunity with him as leader. But I think in the end it's a question of how many that will get through, how many people will come across to the Liberal Party if he becomes leader.
ABC election analyst Anthony Green, thank you. And coming up in 10 minutes, Lee Sales will have more on this developing story. Lee?
Thanks very much, Chris. Coming up at 7:30, we're going to have some interviews with loyal lieutenants in both the Abbott and Turnbull camps. Senator Arthur Sinodinos will explain why he's voting for Malcolm Turnbull. And from the Abbott camp, the Finance Minister Matthias Cormann will make the case for why he's sticking with the incumbent. And right-wing warrior Corey Bernardi will tell us if he could work with the Prime Minister Turnbull. We'll also have full analysis from some of the best political minds in the country, including the ABC's Annabelle Crabb with me in the studio. You do not want to miss 7:30 tonight. Hope to see you then.
Thanks, Lee. Well, so the party room meeting is yet to be scheduled, so stay with us. There'll be rolling coverage on the challenge throughout the night on ABC News 24. But for now, let's get the rest of the day's news from your local newsrooms.